You could pop up and sing that anytime. It's really nice. Dear God, thank you for summer. We pray that we might not simmer too much this summer, but that the weather might be friendly to those, particularly those who are not so lucky to be with us this morning, basking, marinating in the Spirit. Amen. So, a little bit of history. From the dawn of civilization until the time of Jesus, it appears that human life hardly changed at all. I mean, farming gradually replaced hunting and gathering. Beer was invented when rain got into somebody's stash of grain and it fermented. And people, as a result, decided to live in larger living groups so they'd always have a surplus of grain so they'd always have beer. That was big. But next to nothing else really changed. People went from wearing animal skins to plant fibers. Humans went from wielding stone tools to bronze tools to iron tools, and then Romans invented cement. That's it. I covered it pretty much, all the big ones, in 5 sentences. And up to the time of the Crusades, most people traveled no more than 5 or 6 miles away from the place where they were born in their lifetime. Traders, soldiers, sailors moved about freely even in ancient times, but most people stayed put. Everything they busied themselves with was in the narrow scope of one zip code from birth to death. They expected little from themselves, and they expected next to nothing from anybody else. They didn't want surprises, which fits perfectly with the story that we have today from Jesus and his return to his tiny home village, Nazareth. He experienced quite a lot of success, in his ministry. We've covered it in the last weeks. He has secured the loyalty of 12 disciples. He's taught people about the reign of God and how different it was from the reign of Caesar. He's dazzled people far and wide with his provocative parables. He's exorcised demons. He's healed the sick. He calmed a storm. He raised a little girl from the dead. You'd think he'd have become something of a local hero, right? But that is not what Mark's gospel tells us. In this morning's story, Jesus enters the synagogue of his boyhood and begins to teach in the tradition of rabbis. At first, things go well. His townspeople receive his words with astonishment and curiosity. Where did this man get all this, they ask? What is this wisdom that's been given to him? How remarkable are all these accounts of what's been wrought by his carpenter hands? But instead of, self-congratulation, instead of the townspeople lifting Jesus up on their shoulders and carrying him about town, something else happens. Biblical interpreter Debbie Thomas imagines it this way. She says, someone in the crowd, maybe a jealous old neighbor of Mary's, or a childhood rival of Jesus's, or the notorious village gossip who loves stirring up dissension, starts asking prickly questions. Is this not the carpenter? And really, that word really means day laborer. Is not this the day laborer, the son of Mary and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? C- students, all of them. Are not his sisters here among us? At this point, the text tells us that the mood in the synagogue shifts. Appreciation morphs into accusation. Curiosity becomes contempt. And the people take offense. They decide that Jesus is presuming too much, exceeding his bounds. He's just not staying in his lane, to use a phrase that we've come to use a lot lately. Apparently, that phrase became prominent in 2018 when the National Rifle Association criticized emergency room doctors in the U.S. for commenting on America's gun crisis. Doctors should stay in their lane, the NRA tweeted. That is, they should practice medicine and stick to their area of expertise instead of expressing opinions on subjects they know nothing about. Well, the doctors responded immediately by sharing stories of patients who had arrived in their emergency rooms following traumatic gun-related injuries or just flat-out death. This is our lane, they tweeted. Boundaries are critical, of course. Part of maturity has to do with, having good boundaries. Knowing what we should be busy with and what we should leave alone. However, the text today says we shouldn't be too glib about using that phrase. Jesus' family and neighbors were clearly threatened by his gifts. They were frankly troubled by his talent, his ambition, how articulate he was. He seemed uppity to them. They ran him down by saying he just wasn't acting like his mother's son. Now, in her sermon, Sapping God's Strength, Barbara Brown Taylor points out that the only reason to identify a man by his mother in Jesus' day is to question the circumstances of his birth. To highlight the fact that no one knows for sure who his father is by referring to Jesus as the son of Mary is a calculated smackdown on the part of his fellow villagers, right? It's a weaponized use of Jesus' birth story to humiliate him into silence. Well, in a social system where one's status is fixed at birth, it's not the norm for somebody like Jesus, a mere day laborer of questionable parentage, to amount to anything. He has no business rising above his dicey beginnings, no business becoming a leader, much less the Messiah. We know exactly where you come from, boy, they say. Don't get too big for your britches. Well, the one really curious outcome of this story is that the townspeople's suspicion and resentment diminish Jesus' ability to work miracles on their behalf. He could do no deed of power there, it says. Mark writes that with a grim kind of finality. In some mysterious and disturbing way, the people's small-mindedness, their inability to embrace a new facet of Jesus' life and mission, keep them in spiritual poverty. Their negativity constrains Jesus. It blocks the healing work that he wants to do for all these people he loves. Now think about that. Is it possible that our attitudes, the way we address the people around us, how we express ourselves, at the grocery store, church, at school, about the issues of the day have real-world consequences? That in the mysterious economy of God, we are called to participate with God's Spirit in the transformation of the world, but that our refusal to do so, our jaded attitude maybe about things, might just mess it all up. Maybe something precious is lost when we fail to recognize the unfamiliar with the familiar. Right there in it. When we turn a blind eye to the extraordinary, like Jesus, within the ordinary rabble of a small town like Nazareth, we're apt to miss the presence of God in our midst. So how and when and where do we miss out on the sacred because we expect God to stay in God's lane? Because we insist that Jesus speak in, time-worn ways we know best from a lifetime of hearing mediocre sermons or our memories of Sunday school. Do we recoil when God shows up unexpectedly and dares to do a brand new thing? Once in this gospel, Jesus' mom and siblings come to round him up because, he's kind of unorthodox. They think he's gone off his rocker. An analogy today might be Robert Kennedy Jr. Think of his family edging further and further away from him and his loony conspiracy theories as he runs for president. They say they love him, but they also say he's become a nut job. Well, Parker Palmer is a wonderful Quaker theologian who writes books and lectures and leads workshops and retreats all over the place for church groups and nonprofits and big corporations. He's very much in demand and very busy, and a few years ago he was visiting his mother, who at the time was in her 80s. She just didn't quite understand what her son did for a living, why he didn't have a regular, 9-to-5 job. Palmer explained patiently that he visits churches and universities and corporations where he lectures, conducts workshops, and consults very widely. I see, she said. You talk to people and they pay you for it. That's right, Mother. I talk and they pay me. That's what I do for a living. Well, she said, Parker, I like it when you come to visit me and talk to me, but I certainly wouldn't pay you for it. Barbara Brown Taylor says, God is all around us, speaking to us through the most unlikely people. Sometimes it's some mysterious stranger, but more often, I suspect, it is people so familiar that we simply overlook them. Our own children and parents, our own friends and neighbors, all those hometown prophets who challenge us and love us and tell us who we are. Well, the disconcerting truth about this week's story is that we, the readers of this text, are the modern day equivalent of Jesus' ancient townspeople. We're the ones who think we know Jesus best, the ones jaded maybe by religious overfamiliarity. What will it take to follow him into new and uncomfortable territory today, to see him where we least want to look for him? Southminster, this church has a long-held reputation in this presbytery of nearly 100 churches for thinking outside the box about Jesus. About 10 years ago, I think, a conservative Presbyterian church located in southern Oregon, a church which, in fact, has since left our denomination, once asked this presbytery to assemble a judicial commission to investigate Southminster, because they said we veered from Orthodox belief, that we bring in liberal Bible scholars. We must be a bunch of heretics. Well, the group just embarrassed themselves doing it, and it became a badge of honor for this church. In any case, this is why we today look at these familiar texts, every 3 to 6 years, when they show up, as they do regularly in our lectionary. That's the cycle of readings we look at. Because, every 3 to 6 years, at least every generation, you find new things to say about Jesus' teachings and his actions and how they speak to the modern specific circumstances of our time. Because, being human, we are likely to miss what might be right there in front of our eyes unless we try to expect, kickstart our expectations so that we might expect the Spirit, which we believe is alive, to open our eyes and hearts anew to see new things from time to time, new things in those old texts. And the uncomfortable fact is Jesus offends his beloved community in this story. And look, if the Jesus we worship never offends us, then, my friends, it's not really Jesus we're worshiping, right? It's just there. It's just going to happen. So, when was the last time Jesus made you angry by stepping out of the lane you've placed him in? When was the last time he questioned whatever it is you call holy? Your conservatism, your progressivism maybe, your July 4th patriotism, your wokeness. Take your pick. When did Jesus, whoever he is to you, challenge you to look beyond any of those things in order to find him, who he is today? The call of the gospel is not a call to stand still, I'm saying here. It's a call to choose movement over inertia, change over security. So I wonder, how do I refuse to let others in my life grow and change? I'm trying to see all the ramifications of this text. And I'm not just talking about our concept of Jesus here. When do I box the people I love or work next to into identities that are narrow and constricting? Do I allow the people I'm close to become what they are on their way to becoming? Do I allow myself the same? Or do I cut myself and others off with expectations that are just stifling? There's a negative voice in every one of us, that says you will always be small, weak, broken, insufficient, disappointing. You will never outgrow your background, your race, family, upbringing, wounds, addictions. It's that voice that Jesus heard in his hometown, but we carry it with us too. I heard that voice a lot when I was young. My dad worked for the phone company. I'm the first person in my family to go to college. Who was I to presume I could work at a white-collar job? Was I a mere imposter, right? Going to graduate school twice. Looking outwardly again now, whose voices have we sidelined, across history? Whose perspectives do we still deem unworthy of prophetic authority because we like the biases and prejudices, that we've nursed for decades? Here's what I mean. When Jesus tells his disciples to shake the dust off their sandals anytime they meet with rejection and prejudice, he may be inviting them to indulge their feeling of resentment that comes naturally of being, tossed aside. Maybe he's asking them to go ahead and say, someday you'll be sorry, you numbskulls. He may be saying that, but I kind of doubt it. Maybe instead he is inviting us all to face the future and shake the dust of the past off of our keen sandals or Birkenstocks or flip-flops or whatever it is we like to wear in the summer. Whether these things you're challenged to leave behind are failures or hurts, confusions or disappointments, he may be asking us to look to a new future. So ask yourself today, along with me, do my actions and my attitude encourage or inhibit the coming of God, breaking into this present moment? Or am I too in love with the past? A real past or a leave it to Beaver 1950s, I like Ike past, that I've pretty much made up. Because remember, Jesus could not do what he had come to Nazareth to do because they inhibited him. And as strange as it may sound, we may find ourselves in their sandals, especially we clergy types, because we got skin in this game, In his 1963 letter, written from the Birmingham, Alabama jail, one of the most important documents in the history of this country, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of the need to stop the foot dragging that was going on in civil rights. He spoke directly to white clergymen who were saying to him, "Be prudent, Martin. Wait, the time isn't ripe yet." To them, Dr. King said, "For years now I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. Justice too long delayed is justice denied. We have waited," he said, "for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. When you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, When you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling in her eyes, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over, and human beings are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. Man wrote that with pen and paper in a jail cell. And it's as good as any document we have that we call, federal papers. This call for discernment, for self-understanding, that the white clergymen were faced with. Well, the National Democratic Party is having that kind of moment right now, The GOP, the grand old party, had just such a reckoning in the days following January 6, 2021, remember? Lindsey Graham looked at what happened that afternoon at the Capitol. The 160 policemen and men and women seriously injured or dead. The outgoing president of the United States intentionally ignoring his own daughter when she warned him they were liable to lynch his own vice president. Lindsey Graham said, "Enough." And he repeated it, "Enough." Of course, it was way past enough. But the grand old party, the party of Tom McCall, best governor in the history of this state, everything you learn about Tom McCall, he had his low moments, but he was amazing. The GOP, party of Mark Hatfield, maybe the most distinguished member of the United States Senate in my lifetime. That party chose to double down on a huge lie about the election and the violence incited in its wake, and chose instead to embrace the perpetrator. Can you imagine that? Now, I wonder what the Democrats will do and how that will jibe with the movement of the Spirit that's afoot today. I have no idea. I have no idea. Some voices from several sides of that party are saying, "Don't rock the boat. Stay in your lane." I don't pretend to know who's right. I just know that this is a testing time, and the stakes could not be higher.